A blue light illuminated the dark bedroom as Sarah Matthews scrolled through Facebook at 2:17 a.m. The light caught a familiar face that made her heart stop. A profile picture updated just hours ago. The man in the photo was her husband, Professor James Matthews, declared legally dead 7 years earlier. The profile was discovered in a quiet suburban home outside Boston, Massachusetts. James Matthews, 42, had been a respected linguistics professor at Amherst College until his disappearance during a research trip to Peru. His wife found the profile while searching for an old college friend on a sleepless night when memories wouldn't let her rest. James had been the kind of professor students adored, always arriving early with coffee in a thermos that his wife had given him on their first anniversary. He'd wear the same tweed jacket with leather elbow patches that made him look older than his years, but his eyes sparkled with youthful enthusiasm whenever he discussed language evolution. Languages are living things, he would tell Sarah over dinner. They breathe, they grow, they adapt. Every morning he'd kiss Sarah goodbye at exactly 7:45 a.m., saying the same words. Adventure awaits in the mundane. The night before his trip to Peru, he'd packed meticulously, folding each shirt with precision, promising to call every night despite the remote location. "I'll be back before you notice I'm gone," were his last words to her at the airport. The official investigation had concluded with a grim assessment. James's research group reported he'd ventured alone to document an isolated dialect in the Andean highlands. A violent storm had swept through the region. His backpack and research materials were found near a ravine, damaged by weather and scattered across slick rocks. No body was ever recovered despite an extensive search by local authorities and American consular officials. How could he now have an active Facebook profile with recent photos showing him very much alive in what appeared to be a coastal town? And why was he using his real name? The first real clue emerged when Sarah examined the photos more carefully. In one image, partially hidden behind James, was a street sign in Portuguese, not Spanish. Brazil, not Peru. The geolocation data had been disabled, but a marina visible in the background had a distinctive blue and white striped lighthouse. Could James have staged his disappearance to start a new life in Brazil? But why would he suddenly become visible online after all these years? Detective Michael Rodriguez sat across from Sarah in her living room, reviewing screenshots of the profile. "This changes everything," he said, tapping a photo showing James standing beside a small fishing boat. "Look at his hand. He's wearing his wedding ring." Sarah hadn't noticed this detail, too shocked by seeing her husband's face. The ring was unmistakable, platinum with an engraved pattern she had designed herself. But most strikingly, the photo was dated just 3 days ago. Why would a man who faked his death continue wearing his wedding ring 7 years later? The investigation accelerated when Sarah received a private message from the account. It contained just 3 words. "Not James. Danger." The message disappeared minutes later, and the entire profile vanished within the hour. Digital forensics specialists attempted to recover data from Facebook's servers, but found the account had been created only 2 weeks prior, using sophisticated methods to bypass normal verification procedures. Someone wanted Sarah to see her husband, or wanted her to believe he was alive. But who would go to such elaborate lengths? Police discovered an unusual pattern when reviewing James's financial records from before his disappearance. 3 separate withdrawals of $5,000 each had been made in the month before his Peru trip, all from ATMs in different states during weekends when James had claimed to be at academic conferences. Conference organizers confirmed he had indeed presented papers at these events, but hotel records showed he had checked out immediately afterward, leaving his whereabouts unaccounted for during the nights when the withdrawals occurred. What had James been preparing for in those final weeks? The investigation took a dramatic turn when Sarah received a package containing her husband's journal, a leather-bound notebook he had always kept with him. It arrived with no return address, postmarked from Miami. The journal contained research notes, but hidden within the margins were coded messages Sarah had never noticed before. A linguistic professor at Amherst helped decode them. They referenced something called Operation Condor Echo, apparently a reference to both the South American intelligence operation from the 1970s and something more current. The final entry, dated the day before his disappearance, read, "They found the connection. Must move now. Sarah will never understand." Sarah's sister Melissa arrived to provide emotional support, bringing with her a surprising revelation. "James called me the week before he left," she confessed, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "He made me promise not to tell you unless something happened to him. He said he might need to disappear for a while, That he'd gotten involved in something dangerous. I thought he was being dramatic. You know how academics can overthink things. When he actually disappeared, I convinced myself it was just a terrible coincidence. Sarah felt betrayed twice over. By her husband and now by her sister. Why would James confide in Melissa but not his own wife? The Facebook profile briefly reappeared 3 days later with a single new photo. James standing in front of a bulletin board covered in newspaper clippings, many featuring Dr. Gabriel Ortega, a prominent political economist who had been James's colleague at Amherst. Dr. Ortega had specialized in tracking financial flows between North and South American political organizations, work that had earned him both academic praise and apparent enemies. 6 months after James's disappearance, Ortega had died in a car accident that investigators now began to re-examine. Forensic accountants discovered that Ortega's research had identified several shell companies funneling money from American corporations to influence South American politics. One document recovered from Ortega's archived files mentioned a linguistics professor who had inadvertently discovered communication patterns in financial documents that revealed coordination between seemingly unrelated entities. The professor wasn't named, but the timing aligned perfectly with James's disappearance. Had James's expertise in linguistic patterns led him to uncover something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden? A drone search organized by a volunteer group specialized in missing persons cases yielded shocking results. Footage of the original search area in Peru revealed that the ravine where James's belongings were found had a narrow path hidden by dense vegetation, a path not thoroughly explored in the original search due to dangerous conditions. The drone's thermal imaging captured what appeared to be a small shelter approximately 2 miles from the ravine. Local authorities were mobilized to investigate. Sarah received an encrypted email from an anonymous sender containing flight records, showing that a man traveling under the name James Martin had flown from Lima to Rio de Janeiro the day after the storm. The attached photo from airport security cameras clearly showed James, alive and apparently uninjured. The email contained a single line of text: "He didn't run from you. He ran for you." What danger had been so great that James believed disappearing was the only way to protect his wife? The shelter discovered by the drone contained no sign of recent habitation but did yield a weatherproof container hidden beneath floorboards. Inside was a USB drive and a letter addressed to authorities dated the day of James's disappearance. The letter explained that James had uncovered evidence that certain American companies were using linguistic cues in their financial reports to signal collusion with South American partners engaged in illegal resource extraction. His linguistics expertise had allowed him to identify patterns that traditional financial investigators had missed. "They know I've figured it out," the letter stated. "This isn't about academic research anymore. Lives are at stake." The Brazilian Federal Police confirmed they had a case file on an American expatriate living under the name James Martin in a coastal town near Salvador. This man had been teaching English and linguistics at a local school for nearly 7 years, but had vanished 3 weeks ago, precisely when the Facebook profile had first appeared. Neighbors described him as private but kind, often helping local children with schoolwork. One elderly neighbor mentioned that Professor Martin had recently appeared agitated, telling her, "My past is catching up with me. I may need to move again." Triangulation of cell phone signals associated with the Facebook account placed its user in Miami during the period when the profile was active. FBI agents reviewing security camera footage from internet cafes in the area identified a man who, while not James Matthews, had been photographed with Dr. Ortega at an academic conference years earlier. The man was identified as Victor Diaz, a former student of both Ortega and Matthews who had gone on to work for a cybersecurity firm with government contracts. Was Diaz trying to warn Sarah or lure her into something? Sarah discovered a hidden email account when going through old files on James's desktop computer, an account secured with a password hint only she would understand. Where we first said forever, the password was Cliffs off Moher, the Irish landmark where they had gotten engaged. The inbox contained dozens of drafted emails never sent, all addressed to Sarah. The most recent was from just 1 month ago. 7 years of silence to keep you safe. Now they've found me again. If anything happens, don't trust the official story. Find Victor. He knows where the evidence is. The email suggested James had been alive all this time, maintaining his silence to protect her from whatever he had uncovered. The FBI located Victor Diaz in a hospital in Miami, recovering from what appeared to be a professional assault. When agents questioned him, He initially denied any knowledge of James Matthews, but when shown the Facebook profile, his demeanor changed. "I was trying to warn his wife," Diaz admitted. "James saved my life years ago by helping me understand what we had stumbled into. These companies, they don't just manipulate markets, they eliminate problems. James was supposed to die in Peru. When he escaped, they let him be as long as he stayed hidden. But something changed. They found him again." When asked why he created the fake profile, Diaz explained, "I needed to get Sarah's attention without leaving a direct trail to James. They're watching all the obvious channels." A team of digital forensics experts recovered deleted data from the USB drive found in Peru. It contained financial reports from 5 major corporations with linguistic annotations highlighting subtle patterns in the text. When these patterns were analyzed collectively, they revealed coordinated activities tied to land acquisition and resource extraction in protected areas of the Amazon. Several high-ranking executives were implicated, along with government officials from 3 countries. The evidence was compelling enough that the FBI opened a formal investigation, coordinating with Brazilian and Peruvian authorities. Sarah received another package, this time containing a prepaid phone. It rang minutes after she opened it. The voice on the other end was unmistakable despite 7 years of absence. "Sarah, it's me. I'm so sorry. Everything I did was to protect you." James explained that his linguistic analysis had accidentally uncovered a communication system used by corporate criminals to coordinate their activities across borders. "When they realized what I'd found, they sent someone to my hotel in Peru. I barely escaped. I've been living in Brazil, teaching under a new name, always looking over my shoulder." His voice broke as he continued, "I wanted to contact you every single day, but they made it clear they would kill you if I ever resurfaced or if the evidence came to light." James revealed that he had been building a comprehensive case over the 7 years, documenting the corporate conspiracy from his hidden location. "Victor was my student. He recognized my work in some of the documents leaked through his cybersecurity job. He's been my only contact with my old life. But someone had discovered their communication, forcing James to flee his Brazilian sanctuary. They found me a month ago. I've been moving ever since. But Victor thought we might have enough evidence now to protect ourselves by going public. The Facebook profile was meant to prepare you, but they caught on to Victor before he could explain everything." While Sarah and James were speaking, FBI agents traced the call to a location near the Florida Keys. By the time local police arrived, they found only the discarded phone. However, security cameras from a nearby marina captured footage of a man matching James's description, boarding a private boat minutes before authorities arrived. The boat's owner was identified as a former colleague of Dr. Ortega, who had left academia to work for an environmental watchdog organization. Was this another ally in James's hidden network? The corporate conspiracy began unraveling when major news outlets published investigative pieces based on the evidence James had compiled. 3 executives were arrested, and subpoenas were issued for corporate records. The story captured international attention. A linguistics professor who had faked his own death to escape corporate hitmen while building a case against environmental crimes and financial corruption. Public pressure mounted for a thorough investigation, making it increasingly difficult for the remaining conspirators to operate in the shadows. Brazilian authorities reported raiding a remote property where they believed James had been hiding. They found evidence of recent occupation and a wall covered in newspaper clippings, maps, and corporate documents, similar to what had been seen in the Facebook photo. Among the items recovered was a detailed dossier on Sarah, her daily routines, friendship circles, even medical records. James hadn't been stalking his wife. He had been assessing the threat level against her, trying to determine if it was safe to contact her. The dossier included surveillance photos of men watching Sarah's house, proof that his fears for her safety had been justified. In a secure FBI facility, Sarah finally reunited with James after 7 years of believing him dead. He looked older, thinner, his once neatly trimmed beard now wild and streaked with gray. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice cracking. "Every day I would pretend to talk to you, tell you about my day." Sarah struggled with conflicting emotions, joy at finding him alive, anger at his decision to leave her in grief, and fear about their future. "I understand if you can't forgive me," James said. "I made a choice to protect you instead of trusting you with the truth. I'll regret that forever." As the case against the corporate conspiracy strengthened, federal prosecutors offered James and Sarah witness protection, new identities, a new home, a completely fresh start. The decision before them was impossible. Reclaim some version of their former lives under constant security, or disappear together into new identities, leaving behind friends, family, and their entire history. I disappeared once to save you, James told Sarah. I won't decide for us again. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Sarah looked at the stranger her husband had become and wondered if enough remained of the man she had married to rebuild a life with him. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when investigators identified the source of the threat that had forced James to flee Brazil. The daughter of one of the implicated executives had been a student in James's English class. Recognizing him from a photograph in her father's files labeled, "Presumed Dead, Confirm," she had innocently mentioned the resemblance to her father, setting off the renewed hunt. The corporate conspiracy had tentacles reaching further than anyone had initially suspected, with connections to intelligence agencies and organized crime groups acting as enforcers. 7 executives from 3 corporations eventually faced charges ranging from conspiracy to environmental crimes to attempted murder. 2 government officials committed suicide before arrest. The full extent of the operation James had uncovered proved even more significant than his initial discovery, involving billions in illegal profits from environmental exploitation. His linguistic analysis methodology became a new tool for financial crime investigators worldwide, with several universities developing programs based on his approach to detecting communication patterns in corporate documents. 1 year after James's return, he and Sarah stood at the edge of a cliff in Ireland, the same spot where they had gotten engaged years earlier. They were living under their own names again, though with ongoing security precautions. Adventure awaits in the mundane, James said, repeating his old phrase with new meaning. Sarah looked at her husband, now both familiar and strange to her. The past year had been a difficult journey of rebuilding trust and relearning each other. I still haven't decided if what you did was unforgivably wrong or impossibly brave, she admitted. James nodded. Maybe it was both. The psychological toll of James's years in hiding had left deep scars. He struggled with hypervigilance, startling at sudden movements and checking exits wherever they went. Sarah had found him several times in the middle of the night, gathering their essential documents, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Recovery would be a long process, their therapist warned. Some trauma never fully heals. You simply learn to carry it differently. For Sarah, the challenge was learning to trust that James wouldn't disappear again, that each goodbye wouldn't be the last. In a final twist that made international headlines, one of the corporations implicated in the conspiracy filed for bankruptcy after class action lawsuits from indigenous communities affected by their environmental crimes. During the bankruptcy proceedings, internal documents revealed a contingency list of 16 academics around the world who had been flagged as potential threats due to their research. 3 on the list had died in apparent accidents similar to Dr. Ortega's. James had escaped becoming another statistic only through quick thinking and a willingness to sacrifice his own life, at least on paper. James returned to teaching, though at a different university and in a different capacity. His story had made him something of an academic celebrity, though he shunned most public attention. His new research focused on communication patterns in criminal enterprises, work that built on his inadvertent discovery, but pursued it intentionally and with proper protection. Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar role of protective spouse, worrying each time his research touched on powerful interests. Their roles had reversed in subtle ways, each forever changed by the years apart. The Facebook profile that had started the final chapter of their story was eventually traced to a complex operation run by Victor Diaz. As James's former student and an expert in cybersecurity, he had created a digital breadcrumb trail designed to bring Sarah into the investigation, while minimizing risk to both her and James. I knew if you saw his face, you wouldn't stop until you found the truth, Victor explained, when he finally recovered enough to speak with Sarah. James saved my life by warning me when they came after him. I owed him the chance to get his life back. On the 7th anniversary of James's return, 14 years after his disappearance, Sarah found herself looking at the Facebook Memories feature, showing photos from their rebuilt life. There were no images from those 7 lost years, just an emptiness that would always remain a part of their story. She thought about the complex moral calculus of James's decision, the greater good versus personal loyalty, protection versus honesty, safety versus agency. The corporate criminals had been brought to justice, environmental protections strengthened, and lives saved. But at what personal cost? The case became a landmark study in journalism schools and ethics courses worldwide. When does one's obligation to expose wrongdoing outweigh personal relationships? James had chosen to sacrifice his marriage to protect both his wife and the evidence he was gathering. Philosophers debated whether he had the right to make that unilateral decision, while security experts cited the case in arguments for better whistleblower protections. The Matthews case demonstrated how corporations had gained powers once associated only with authoritarian governments, the power to make people disappear. In the quiet moments when the public interest in their story faded, Sarah and James faced the most difficult question. Who were they to each other now? "Sometimes I feel I'm married to a ghost," Sarah confessed during a therapy session. "The James I knew died in Peru. I'm still learning who this man is." James nodded slowly. "The Sarah I left behind is gone too. We're both haunting each other." Their therapist suggested that perhaps the solution wasn't trying to recapture what was lost, but rather building something entirely new from the shared wreckage of their past lives. Despite the challenges, there were moments of profound connection that suggested healing was possible. Walking along a beach near their new home, James suddenly stopped and pointed to a pattern in the sand where waves had created ripples. "Languages in nature," he said with a flash of his old enthusiasm. "Patterns carrying information if you know how to read them." Sarah had taken his hand then, the familiar intellectual passion in his eyes momentarily bridging the gap between past and present versions of her husband. The final public chapter of their story came when James published a memoir detailing his years in hiding. The book became an international bestseller, translated into 26 languages. Critics praised its unflinching examination of moral compromise and the personal cost of standing against corporate power. Sarah chose not to read it, explaining, "I'm more interested in the man who came back than the one who disappeared." Some wounds were still too raw to examine directly. Experts in trauma and recovery pointed to the Matthews case as an example of ambiguous loss, grief without closure that complicates the healing process. For 7 years, Sarah had mourned a husband who wasn't dead. Now she had to reconcile with a living man who wasn't quite the husband she remembered. Their story challenged conventional narratives about love and loyalty, suggesting that sometimes the deepest expression of love might look like betrayal from certain angles. The documentary 7 Years Gone interviewed both Sarah and James, capturing their still evolving attempt to understand their own story. On a cool autumn morning 14 years and 1 day after James had been declared legally dead, he stood in front of a university classroom again. "Language shapes reality," he told his students. "The words we choose, the patterns we create, they don't just describe our world, they help construct it." In the back of the classroom, Sarah watched her husband, seeing echoes of the young professor she had fallen in love with decades earlier. They were not the same people who had said goodbye at an airport all those years ago. But perhaps they could be something new, something tempered by fire and absence, something stronger at the broken places. The question that haunted them both, that followed them through therapy sessions and quiet dinners and sleepless nights, was both simple and impossible. Had it been worth it? The corporations had been held accountable, environments protected, future crimes prevented, but 14 years had been irreparably damaged. There was no mathematical formula to balance the equation, no linguistic pattern that could make perfect sense of such a calculus. It was a question with no single answer, a story with no clean ending, and so James and Sarah Matthews continued their imperfect reconciliation, day by day building a bridge between who they had been and who they had become. Their story spread across social media, through news cycles into case studies and books, a modern legend about death and resurrection, about the cost of truth and the nature of love. But the most important parts of their story remained private, unfolding in quiet moments known only to them. A hand reached for across the darkness, a familiar phrase spoken in a new voice, the slow, deliberate choice to begin again. 3 months after the publication of James's memoir, Sarah woke to find his side of the bed empty. A moment of panic seized her chest. Had it happened again? Had he disappeared once more? She rushed through their house, heart pounding, only to find him sitting on the back porch watching the sunrise. "I couldn't sleep," he explained, not turning to look at her. "I keep thinking about Victor." Victor Diaz had been found dead in his apartment the previous week, an apparent suicide that neither of them believed. The official investigation had closed quickly. Too quickly. The corporate entities they had exposed might have been damaged, but the people behind them still held power, influence, and most dangerously, grudges. That evening, a package arrived addressed to both James and Sarah. Inside was Victor's personal laptop and a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, they got to me, but I was ready. Everything is here. Finish what we started." The laptop contained encrypted files that James spent 3 days decoding. What they found expanded the conspiracy beyond anything they had previously uncovered. The environmental crimes in South America were merely one branch of a much larger operation involving weapons trafficking, political manipulation across 4 continents, and a complex money laundering scheme that implicated dozens of supposedly legitimate businesses. "Victor knew," James whispered, scrolling through document after document. "He knew, and he kept digging even after we thought it was over." The new evidence suggested that what they had exposed was only the outer layer of a much more dangerous organization, one that had temporarily retreated but was now rebuilding under new corporate entities. Sarah watched the familiar intensity return to James's eyes, the same obsessive focus that had led him to disappear for 7 years. "We need to take this to the FBI," she said firmly. James shook his head. "There are names in here. Government officials, federal judges. We don't know who we can trust." The argument that followed was their worst since his return, echoing through their house like thunder. "I won't lose you to this again," Sarah shouted. "I won't spend another 7 years wondering if you're dead or alive." James's response was quiet but cutting. "Would you rather we both end up like Victor?" They compromised by approaching a journalist who had covered the original story, Catherine Chen, who had built her reputation on thorough vetting and protecting sources. Meeting in a public park with no electronic devices, James handed over copies of key documents from Victor's files. "This is bigger than what we brought down before," he explained, "and more dangerous." Catherine studied them carefully. "You realize what this means? You'll never be truly safe as long as these people have power." Sarah took James's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We haven't been truly safe for 14 years. At least this way, we're fighting back together." Catherine's investigation proceeded methodically, building an airtight case before publishing anything. Meanwhile, Sarah began noticing subtle signs they were being watched again. Cars parked too long on their street, a jogger who appeared at the same time each day but never seemed to sweat, small inconsistencies in their home when they returned from errands. James installed new security systems, changed their routines randomly, and began teaching Sarah the survival skills he had developed during his years in hiding. "I never wanted you to need these," he said as he showed her how to detect if someone had been in their home. "But I should have trusted you to be strong enough the first time." The tension of waiting for Catherine's story to break wore on them both. James suffered from increasingly severe insomnia, often spending entire nights staring out windows or reviewing Victor's files for details they might have missed. Sarah found herself jumping at small noises, checking locks multiple times, scrutinizing strangers in public places. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Sarah found James sitting in the dark, holding the wedding ring he had never stopped wearing during his 7 years away. "Do you ever wish I had stayed dead?" he asked. "That the Facebook profile had never appeared? You had built a life without me." Sarah sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "It was half a life," she answered. "Even with all this fear, even with the not knowing what comes next, I choose the whole truth over comfortable lies." Catherine Chen's expose published on a Tuesday morning, simultaneously appearing in major newspapers across 12 countries. The evidence was damning. Financial transactions, internal memos, recorded conversations provided by Victor before his death. Within hours, stock prices plummeted for the implicated companies. By evening, arrest warrants had been issued in multiple jurisdictions. James and Sarah watched the news coverage in silence, holding hands on their couch. "Victor did it," Sarah whispered. "He finished the job." James nodded, but his expression remained grave. "These people don't give up power easily. The most dangerous time is now when they're cornered." That night, they received an encrypted message from Catherine. Multiple sources confirm contract killers dispatched. Safe house ready. Instructions follow. James looked at Sarah, the question unspoken between them. "I'm not letting you go alone this time," she said before he could speak. "Wherever we go together." They packed essential items, documents, emergency cash, burner phones, following the protocol James had established months earlier. As they prepared to leave, Sarah paused in their bedroom doorway, looking back at the life they'd carefully rebuilt. "We'll come back," James promised, though they both recognized the uncertainty in his voice. The safe house was a remote cabin in northern Michigan, accessible only by a private road and surrounded by dense forest. Catherine had arranged for it through journalist protection networks, ensuring no paper trail connected to either her or the Matthews. Their first night there, huddled by a wood stove as snow fell outside, Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her. Will this ever be over? Will we ever just be two people living ordinary lives? James stared into the flames. I don't think ordinary was ever our path. Not from the moment I first saw those patterns in the financial documents. He looked up at her. But we could find a different kind of life. Something true, if not conventional. A week passed in the isolation of the cabin. News trickled in through secure channels. More arrests, some suspects fleeing, others found dead before they could testify. The organization was collapsing, but its death throes were violent and unpredictable. On the 8th day, they received word that their home had been broken into, methodically searched, and then burned to the ground. Investigators found professional accelerants and evidence that the fire had been set to destroy rather than to kill. The intruders had known they weren't there. They're looking for Victor's original files, James concluded. They don't know we've already distributed copies to secure locations. The winter deepened around their hideaway, days shortening as December approached. They established new routines in their temporary home. James chopping wood each morning, Sarah cooking meals from their stockpiled supplies, both of them taking turns watching the approach to the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire and talk, really talk, about the years they had lost and the future they might still build. I used to dream about you, Sarah confessed one night. Not that you were alive, but that you would visit me as a ghost, just to check on me. I would wake up so angry that even your spirit had abandoned me. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I wrote you letters I knew I could never send. Hundreds of them. Each time I moved, I would burn them and start again. It was the only way I could still talk to you. 3 weeks into their seclusion, they received a coded message from Catherine. A grand jury had been convened to hear evidence against the highest-ranking members of the conspiracy. Their testimony would be required, but the proceedings would be sealed and their identities protected. It's happening, James said, a cautious optimism in his voice for the first time in months. The legal system is finally catching up to what we uncovered. That night, they allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond hiding. Perhaps not the life they had once planned, but something with more freedom than they had known since James first disappeared in Peru. The journey to Washington, D.C., for their testimony was arranged through federal marshals, a complex route involving multiple vehicles, safe houses, and no digital footprint. Sarah found herself studying the marshals' techniques, realizing how similar they were to the methods James had developed on his own during his years in hiding. You would have made a good marshal, she whispered to him as they changed vehicles at a secure location in Ohio. He smiled grimly. I had good motivation to learn quickly. The grand jury proceedings were held in a windowless room, deep within a federal building with armed guards at every entrance. For 10 hours, James and Sarah testified separately about what they had uncovered, the threats they had faced, and the evidence Victor Diaz had compiled before his death. When they emerged from their testimony, their federal protection detail had troubling news. 2 marshals assigned to another witness in the case had been found dead, their secure location compromised. We're moving you immediately, the lead marshal informed them. Different route than planned, different destination. Sarah felt James tense beside her, his body shifting subtly into the alertness she had come to recognize as his survival mode. Within 30 minutes, they were in an armored SUV driving through a December snowstorm toward an undisclosed location. Just like old times, James said softly. Only for her ears. Sarah squeezed his hand. Not like old times. This time we're together. The new safe house was a former military installation, repurposed for witness protection. Concrete walls, limited windows, constant armed guards. Other witnesses in the case were being housed in separate sections of the facility. James and Sarah were given a small apartment within the complex. Spartan but secure. How long? Sarah asked the marshal who showed them the space. Until the immediate threat is neutralized, came the non-committal reply. Could be weeks, could be months. That night in the unfamiliar bed, Sarah woke to find James sitting up, completely still, listening. What is it? She whispered. Probably nothing, he answered. But his body remained tense, alert to something she couldn't perceive. Christmas came and went within the confines of the secure facility. They exchanged small gifts purchased through their protection detail, a book for James, a silver bracelet for Sarah, our second Christmas together after 7 apart. James noted as they shared a simple meal in their quarters. Not exactly what I imagined for our reunion. Sarah twirled the bracelet around her wrist. We'll have better ones. This isn't the end of our story. Later that night, an alarm blared through the facility. A perimeter breach quickly contained but unsettling nonetheless. Someone had tested the defenses, probing for weaknesses. The marshals doubled the guard rotation and restricted movement within the complex even further. In January, news came that the grand jury had returned indictments against 32 individuals, including former government officials, corporate executives, and hired operatives. Trials were set to begin in the spring, with James and Sarah scheduled as key witnesses. Their protection detail began preparing them for the public exposure the trials would bring, coaching them on courtroom procedures, practicing cross-examination scenarios, developing contingency plans for various security threats. Once your testimony is public, there's no going back into complete anonymity, the lead marshal explained. We need to prepare for a lifetime of managed risk. The first assassination attempt came in February, not against them but against Catherine Chen, a car bomb that she escaped only because a last-minute interview ran long. The incident changed the security protocols around all witnesses and individuals connected to the case. James and Sarah were moved again, this time to a location they weren't even told the name of, somewhere in the western United States. They're getting desperate, James observed as they settled into yet another temporary home. The trials are getting closer, and they know how strong the evidence is. Sarah had begun to recognize the patterns too, the escalation of violence, the increasing resources being deployed against them. She was becoming fluent in the language of danger that James had been speaking for years. Spring brought the beginning of the first trial, with James scheduled to testify about the linguistic patterns he had discovered in the corporate documents. The security operation to transport him to the courthouse and back was elaborate. Decoy vehicles, airspace restrictions, snipers positioned on surrounding buildings. Sarah watched him dress for court in the suit the marshals had provided, adjusting his tie with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. "You look like a professor again," she said with a small smile. He met her eyes in the mirror. "I haven't felt like one in a very long time." Before leaving, he held her tightly. "I'll see you tonight." It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a promise he intended to keep. His testimony lasted 2 days, broadcast on closed-circuit television to the secure facility where Sarah remained. She watched him explain complex linguistic concepts to the jury, demonstrating how corporate communications had contained hidden patterns that coordinated illegal activities. His academic precision returned as he spoke, the passionate teacher emerging from behind years of necessary paranoia. On cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to paint him as a man who had abandoned his wife, faked his own death, and lived under false identities. Hardly a credible witness. "Yes, I did those things," James acknowledged on the stand. "To stay alive long enough to bring this evidence to light, to protect my wife from people who had already killed to keep their secrets." The simple honesty of his answer seemed to resonate with the jury. When James returned to the secure facility, exhausted but relieved to have his testimony completed, he found Sarah waiting with unexpected news. "They've offered us a permanent solution," she explained. "Not witness protection, something more comprehensive, a complete reset overseas with ongoing security monitoring, but more independence than traditional programs." The offer had come through channels connected to international corporate crime enforcement, agencies that recognized the global significance of what James and Victor had uncovered. "We'd have new identities, new backgrounds, but we'd be able to build something closer to a normal life. Teaching positions at a university if we wanted." James sat heavily on the edge of their bed. "Where?" he asked. Sarah handed him the folder. "New Zealand. About as far from all of this as we can get." The decision wasn't simple. Accepting meant leaving everything and everyone behind permanently. Sarah's sister, their remaining friends, any connection to their former lives. Staying meant continuing to live under the shadow of threat, moving from safe house to safe house as the trials progressed. "I've already lost you once," Sarah said as they discussed the options late into the night. "I don't want to spend whatever time we have left looking over our shoulders." James nodded slowly. "But it would be another kind of disappearance. Another death on paper, even if we're together this time." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. To reclaim their lives, They would need to abandon them all over again. In the end, they chose New Zealand. The operation to get them there was classified at the highest levels. Even their protection detail wasn't informed of the full plan. They were moved through 3 different locations in the span of a week, their trail obscured by deliberate misinformation and digital misdirection. On a rainy Tuesday in April, they boarded a military transport plane under cover of darkness, carrying only what fit in 2 small bags. Sarah took one last look at American soil as the plane lifted off. "Goodbye again," she whispered. Beside her, James took her hand. "Hello to whatever comes next," he replied. Their new home was a modest house on New Zealand's South Island, remote enough for security but connected to a small university town where they had both been offered teaching positions. James would teach linguistics again, though focusing on entirely different areas than his previous research. Sarah, who had retrained as a counselor during the years James was gone, would work with the university's student services. They arrived in winter, the southern hemisphere's seasons opposite to what they had left behind. Cold rain fell as they were shown their new home, their new identification documents, their new lives. Professor and Dr. Ellis, the security liaison, introduced them to their cover story, recently relocated from Canada. Adapting to their new identities was both easier and harder than expected. The mechanics were simple enough, learning to respond to new names, memorizing the details of their fabricated backgrounds, establishing daily routines that would appear natural to neighbors and colleagues. The emotional reality was more complex. "Sometimes I forget who I'm supposed to be," Sarah confessed one night, 6 months into their new life. "I was in a faculty meeting today and almost signed my real name to the attendance sheet." James understood. He had similar moments of disconnection, of feeling like an actor in his own life. "Maybe that's the final cost of what happened," he suggested. "Living with multiple versions of ourselves, never fully inhabiting any single one." Yet there were moments of genuine peace, too. Teaching again brought James a joy he had forgotten was possible. His students found him somewhat reserved but passionate about his subject, always willing to spend extra time explaining difficult concepts. Sarah discovered that her experience with loss and uncertainty made her especially effective as a counselor, able to connect with students facing their own life transitions. They began making cautious friendships with colleagues, revealing edited versions of their past that contained emotional truths, if not factual ones. "We met in graduate school," they would explain at dinner parties. "Spent some time apart due to research opportunities. Found our way back to each other." Their security detail maintained a discreet presence, regular check-ins, monitoring of potential threats, quarterly updates on the status of the trials back in the United States. The first convictions came in October, with 3 executives receiving lengthy sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. James and Sarah followed the news remotely, their testimony having been completed via secure video link rather than requiring their physical presence. 20 years, James noted, as they read about the sentencing of the man who had likely ordered the original attempt on his life in Peru. "It's something, at least." Sarah heard the dissatisfaction in his voice. No prison sentence could recover the 7 years they had lost. On the anniversary of their arrival in New Zealand, they hiked to a remote viewpoint overlooking the ocean. The spring air was cool but clear, the landscape impossibly green against the deep blue of the sea. "Do you think we'll ever feel like this is really our life?" Sarah asked as they sat sharing a simple picnic lunch. James considered the question carefully. "I think maybe we're becoming something new, not exactly who we were before Peru, not exactly who we became after. Something that incorporates all of it but isn't defined by any single part." He picked up a smooth stone from beside their blanket, turning it over in his palm, like this, shaped by everything it's experienced, but still itself at the core. Their second year in New Zealand brought unexpected developments. Sarah discovered she was pregnant, something they had discussed but never expected, given the stress their bodies had endured and their advancing age. The pregnancy was high risk from the beginning, requiring careful monitoring and restricted activities. James became intensely protective, checking and rechecking security measures around their home, accompanying Sarah to every medical appointment, researching every possible complication. "I can't lose either of you," he admitted one night, his hand resting on her growing belly. Sarah covered his hand with her own. "We've survived worse than childbirth," she reminded him, though they both recognized the hollow bravado in her words. Some threats couldn't be outmaneuvered or outlasted. Catherine Chen arrived in New Zealand when Sarah was 7 months pregnant, ostensibly on a book tour but actually carrying updated information too sensitive for digital transmission. Meeting in a secure location arranged by their security detail, she shared the latest developments. Victor Diaz's death had been officially reclassified as a homicide, with new evidence linking it to the conspiracy. 3 more executives had been convicted, and investigations had expanded to operations in Asia previously unknown to them. Your work, and Victor's sacrifice, created a cascade effect, Catherine explained. Enforcement agencies around the world are using the patterns you identified to uncover similar operations. Before leaving, she handed them a small package. From Victor's personal effects, his family wanted you to have it. Inside the package was a simple leather notebook, similar to the journal James had kept during his academic career. The pages contained notes in Victor's precise handwriting, observations about encryption techniques, security protocols, corporate forensics, but interspersed between technical entries were more personal reflections. Visited Professor M's old office today. One entry read, "Still can't believe he's alive somewhere. Still can't believe no one else sees what's happening." Another entry, dated shortly before his death. "If anything happens to me, at least I know they'll finish this. Some truths can't stay buried forever." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as James closed the notebook gently. "He knew the risks," James said softly, "just as I did. He made his choice with open eyes." Their daughter was born on a stormy winter night, arriving 3 weeks early but healthy despite the difficult pregnancy. They named her Victoria, the significance clear between them, though never explained to others. James held the tiny infant with trembling hands, overcome with emotion that transcended their complicated circumstances. "She doesn't know any of it," he whispered, as the newborn gripped his finger. "Not the danger, not the running, not the years apart. She just is." Sarah watched them together, feeling a completeness she had thought forever beyond their reach. "She's our future," she replied, "the part of our story that isn't about what happened to us, but what we chose to create despite it." Parenthood brought new challenges to their security protocols. Every pediatrician had to be vetted, every childcare provider thoroughly investigated. They created contingency plans for every scenario, from minor illnesses to major security breaches. Their security detail expanded to include specialists in family protection, experts who helped them balance safety with providing Victoria a relatively normal childhood. "We can't raise her in a bunker," Sarah insisted, when James questioned whether a playgroup was necessary. Being too isolated would mark her as different just as surely as too many protections. Finding the balance became their daily negotiation, their ongoing compromise between caution and living. Victoria grew into a curious, resilient child, adapting easily to the security measures presented as family routines. "We always hold hands in public," she would recite matter-of-factly. "We always tell mommy or daddy if someone we don't know talks to us." By her 4th birthday, she had internalized many of their security protocols without understanding their true purpose. To her, the occasional presence of their security detail was simply mom and dad's work friends. The undeserved normalcy of her childhood was their greatest achievement, a gift they had been unable to give each other, but were determined to provide for their daughter. News from the United States became less frequent as years passed and the trials concluded. The conspiracy had been largely dismantled, its principal architects imprisoned or dead, its operations exposed and shuttered. Their security detail was gradually reduced, though never completely eliminated. "The threat assessment has been downgraded," their liaison explained during a routine check-in. "But institutional memory is long in these types of organizations. Caution remains advisable." James and Sarah understood the subtext. They would never be entirely free of looking over their shoulders, never completely released from the consequences of what they had uncovered. But the space between vigilance and paranoia had widened, allowing room for something approaching ordinary life. On Victoria's 7th birthday, the same number of years James had been missing, they hosted a small party at their home, inviting children from her school and their parents. Watching their daughter blow out candles on her cake, surrounded by friends in a home filled with laughter, Sarah felt a moment of dissonance so profound it left her breathless. This joy, this simple celebration, existed in the same timeline as Peru, as Brazil, as safe houses and grand jury testimony. The separate chapters of their lives had seemed irreconcilable for so long, yet here they were, somehow containing all of it within a single shared existence. James caught her eye across the room, his expression suggesting he felt it too. the strangeness and the wonder of where they had landed. Late that night, after the party had ended and Victoria was asleep, they sat on their back porch looking at stars neither of them had grown up seeing in the Northern Hemisphere. 7 years, Sarah said quietly. She's been alive exactly as long as you were gone. James nodded, the symmetry not lost on him. I used to think those years were stolen from us, he replied. Now I'm not so sure. Everything that happened, the good and the terrible, led us here. To her, he took Sarah's hand, tracing the lines of her palm as if reading a map. If you could go back knowing everything we know now, would you tell me not to go to Peru? Sarah considered the impossible question, the countless variables, the immeasurable pain and unexpected joy. No, she finally answered, but I would tell you to take me with you. The following spring, James received a message through secure channels that Dr. Gabriel Ortega's death, the car accident that had occurred shortly after James's disappearance, had been officially reopened as a suspected homicide. Forensic advances had revealed evidence of tampering with the vehicle, consistent with methods used by operatives connected to the conspiracy. They're still finding pieces of the puzzle, James told Sarah that evening. Still connecting dots we didn't even know existed. The news brought a complex mixture of vindication and renewed grief, confirmation that their suspicions had been correct, but also a reminder of the human cost of standing against such powerful interests. Gabriel had been James's colleague, his friend, a brilliant mind silenced too soon. He never knew that his work continued through you, Sarah said gently, that what he started did eventually come to light. As Victoria grew, she began asking more questions about their past. Natural curiosity about grandparents she had never met, places her parents had lived before New Zealand, the reasons for their occasional security measures. James and Sarah had prepared for this, developing age-appropriate versions of their story that contained emotional truth without traumatic details. Mommy and Daddy helped stop some people who were doing bad things, they explained when she was 8. Because of that, we needed to move very far away and be extra careful about safety. Victoria accepted this with a child's adaptability, filing it alongside other facts about her family. Is that why we have different names in the special box? She asked, referring to the secure container where they kept their original identification documents. James and Sarah exchanged alarmed glances. Neither had shown her that box or discussed its contents. Their daughter's observational skills apparently exceeded their precautions. On a crisp autumn day when Victoria was 9, Sarah received an encrypted message from Catherine Chen. The last major figure in the conspiracy had died in prison, apparently of natural causes. The message included a simple question: would you consider coming back, at least for a visit? That evening, after Victoria was asleep, Sarah and James discussed the possibility for the first time in years. Her grandparents have never met her, Sarah said quietly. My sister has never even seen a photo. The risk assessment had changed substantially. Most of those who had wanted them dead were now themselves dead or imprisoned. Yet habits of caution had become deeply ingrained in them both. We'd need to maintain our current identities, James noted. Keep this life intact while we test the waters of the old one. Sarah nodded. 2 parallel existences. We've managed harder things. Their return to the United States was planned with the same meticulous attention to security that had characterized their departure. Victoria was told they were taking a special vacation to meet family friends they hadn't seen in a long time. Their security detail coordinated with American agencies to establish surveillance and response protocols for the duration of their visit. James found himself falling back into hypervigilance as they boarded the plane in Auckland, scanning faces, noting exits, maintaining awareness of their surroundings that had somewhat relaxed in recent years. Beside him, Sarah squeezed his hand. Together this time, she reminded him, their long-established reassurance. Victoria, excited about her first international flight, remained blissfully unaware of the tension humming beneath her parents' calm exteriors. The reunion with Sarah's sister Melissa took place in a secure location rather than at her home, a compromise between connection and continued caution. When Melissa saw Victoria for the first time, she burst into tears, embracing the confused but receptive child. You look just like your mother did at your age, she told her niece, smoothing Victoria's dark hair with trembling hands. Later, when Victoria was occupied with the gifts Melissa had brought, the adults spoke in lowered voices about the years of separation, the difficult choice to leave, the new life they had built. I understand why you did it, Melissa told them, though the lingering hurt was evident in her voice. But knowing you were alive somewhere, raising a child I couldn't meet, it was its own kind of grief. Sarah held her sister's hand tightly. We're here now, she said simply, and Victoria will know you properly from this day forward, even if from a distance. During their 3-week stay, they met with Catherine Chen, with federal agents who had worked their case, with Victor Diaz's family, who had never fully understood his connection to their story until after his death. Each meeting was arranged with security precautions, each conversation filled with the weight of shared history and divergent paths. Victoria absorbed it all with increasing curiosity, piecing together parts of her parents' past from fragments of adult conversations, forming questions she would later ask in the privacy of their hotel suite. Were you and Daddy heroes? She asked Sarah one night as they prepared for bed. Sarah considered how to answer truthfully without burdening her daughter with too much complexity. We did what seemed necessary, she finally replied. Sometimes that looks like heroism from the outside, even when it doesn't feel like it from within. Before leaving the United States, they made one final visit, to the cemetery where a memorial marker for James Matthews still stood, despite the truth of his survival being known to authorities. Sarah had maintained it during the 7 years she believed him dead, and Melissa had continued tending it after their departure. Standing before the stone that bore his name and an empty date of death, James felt a strange doubling of identity. Here lay the man he had been, academically brilliant but naive to the dangers of the world. Beside him stood the man he had become, shaped by loss and survival into someone far more complex. Victoria read the inscription aloud. James Matthews, beloved husband, brilliant mind, seeker of truth. She looked up at her father with newfound understanding. That was really you, wasn't it? Before you were Daddy. James knelt beside her, meeting her eyes directly. It was part of me, he answered honestly. Just as who I am now is part of me. People can be more than one thing across a lifetime. Their return to New Zealand carried a sense of both completion and continuation. They had closed a loop, reconnected with their past without being recaptured by it. Victoria had absorbed new dimensions of her family history, forming relationships with people who shared her blood but had been absent from her life. Their security detail reported no unusual activity during the trip, no indication they had been recognized or tracked by anyone connected to the old threats. Yet neither James nor Sarah felt ready to fully emerge from hiding. Too many years of caution had written vigilance into their nervous systems, had taught them that safety could be an illusion, even when danger seemed distant. Their visit had been a test, carefully managed and temporary. To permanently reclaim their original identities would require more certainty than either of them expected to feel in this lifetime. As the Southern Hemisphere spring bloomed around their New Zealand home, James found Victoria in his home office one afternoon, examining the old leather notebook that had belonged to Victor Diaz. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious beyond her years. He helped save you, didn't he? The man who wrote in this book. James nodded, sitting beside her at his desk. Yes, he was my student, and then he became something more. A colleague, a friend, eventually the only person who knew I was still alive for a while. Victoria traced the faded handwriting with one finger, and the bad people hurt him. It wasn't a question. James felt the familiar ache of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that others had paid the ultimate price while he had escaped to build a new life. Yes, he acknowledged. He knew the risks, but he chose to fight anyway. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the directness of childhood. Is that why you named me Victoria? After him, James looked at his daughter with surprise. They had never explained the origin of her name, assuming the connection was too subtle for a child to grasp. Yes, he admitted, because his courage helped create the possibility of you. Victoria nodded solemnly. I'm glad, she said simply. It's a good name to live up to. What would you do if the person you mourned for 7 years suddenly reappeared? Would you embrace the miracle, or question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and sacrifice? And after weathering such an impossible reunion, could you find the strength to build a life that honors both what was lost and what was found in the darkness?